My name is David Booth. I'm Deputy Director, Digital Strategy and Operations and the CTO at the Department for Transport. I've been in IT for over 40 years now, a little bit more than I care to remember sometimes, and service delivery and operational service management for probably a little over 20 years. Presentation today is about experiences of ITSM across a number of government engagements. Most recently, that's DfT. But I've spent time working in DWP and Ministry of Justice. Ethan has described the size and scale of DWP, and Ministry of Justice is a similarly sized organisation. Meanwhile, DfT is a much smaller central function, but with very large executive agencies, and it covers the entire breadth of the transport sector in the UK, from roads to rail, aviation, and even parking and such things as Blue Badge. So, how did it all start? No doubt you've all had the problem of green SLAs, but still not quite getting the kind of service your customers expect. Unclear KPIs, inconsistent measurement and control mechanisms, lack of CSI focus. I'm sure that all sounds familiar. Throughout my time working in service delivery in a number of different industries, where we try to capture ITIL context in a contract, I found that a very common theme. I had one supplier in a corporate industry some years ago who I spent many months with to mold the types of reporting we needed. They then went on to use that work as a sales tool. And that ably demonstrated that customer needs were just not understood up front. They didn't know why we wanted that information. They didn't know what information to provide, and they didn't know how to interpret that information or to help us improve the services that they were providing. Nearly 4 years ago, I began working in the Ministry of Justice, and I noticed there's a couple of colleagues on the call. Yes, it is 4 years ago. I led service operations covering 18 ITIL disciplines, and what was a very significant, well, still is a very significant outsourced service desk, and a team of more than 150 internal and a similar number of external partners. At one point, I had one of the largest suppliers arguing over their interpretation of the contract on service transition and the services that they were able to provide or not able to provide for more than 4 months before we found an agreement. That was just absolute lunacy, and nobody was coming to the table to talk about it. Again, this is probably something that many will recognise. A little before I joined, there was an insourcing of the service integration function, so that the team was more about assurance than delivery, and understanding the delivery landscape needed a better framework than ITIL 3. ITIL 4 came along and was implemented, but still missed many of the governance requirements. Government has a very strict set of expectations that need to be employed. They are codified, they are often quite opaque, and to make that sit with a commercial and a legal function in a way that is both explicit but also valuable to the delivery of service is a very difficult thing to do. And that's particularly so in the digital delivery space. Adding to the complexity, there was an attempt to govern across contracts using a shared SLA model. That was just chaos. It wasn't me, it was rife, and there was no way to identify the true causes of service issues. To my memory, I don't think there was ever a service credit issued against the shared SLA in the entire time that it was in place, because it was impossible to identify. So very difficult times, but to be fair, probably quite fortuitous in the end. It was also the coincidence of a number of major programs of work, transformation activities, and of course, contract end across a number of major suppliers all came together. So that gave us the opportunity to do some new things. It was opportunity for a reset into the inclusion of ISO 20K in procurement conversations as part of that reset. So clearly we needed to update our service management system, and the customer needed to be the input and the output. I started to do some research on various models, trying to capture our needs in terms of internal and external customer requirement. MOJ is a large department with over 100,000 internal customers and some citizen-facing services across a number of executive agencies. So it needed a reliable and responsive service model. Everyone talks about the customer at the heart, but many of our processes and the delivery models that they form are often put behind an operational delivery firewall where the end support doesn't ever understand the customer or doesn't ever see or feel or taste what it is that the customer actually tastes every day. So we needed all of the traditional elements to ensure good governance, but the agile delivery component just wasn't sufficiently developed. ITIL 4 talked about it, but it was a bit like that chat with a tradesman at the pub. It leaves you wondering if the conversation will actually end up with someone on the doorstep with tools, or do you have to go looking elsewhere again? Minimum viable service was not a concept that could be agreed on by this loosely operated Agile manifesto, especially when it was partnered with a purist ITIL approach. So MVS is a whole separate conversation, of course, and one for another day, but it does form part of how we deliver iterative developed services. Despite this, there was still value in the ITIL best practice as a means of developing common understanding for the teams. But we did need more, and for all the reasons that both Ethan and Jeff have described in their presentations. This and the prior diagram have unashamedly been borrowed from an article I discovered about a year ago from Adversera. It's well worth a read, actually, if you get a chance. It helps to give that broader view of how both ITIL and ISO 20000 can work together. There's always the need for local work instructions, particularly in the government space. And whilst Agilers often try to avoid the documentation as a bloat to fast-paced delivery, the Agile Manifesto does call for proportional documentation. And Jeff ably described the importance of that documentation process and how to embed that as part of the development and delivery squads. The use of in-house specifics as the foundation, the layering ITIL best practice helps to educate and interface with customer needs and ultimately develop an internal culture. Suppliers often can't be managed in this way, though, because they just don't understand. They haven't been there long enough, especially if there's a churn in your customer support teams with your external partners. And if that delivery that they're providing is not sufficiently specific, there's often not the opportunity for them to learn more about what the services deliver and what the customer actually needs. So codifying the expectations of the recipient team at every point in the delivery chain is key to good customer outcomes. We all know that, but we always find it difficult to achieve. The real bonus to this approach is that it works equally well internally and externally. Internal delivery teams can be assured in exactly the same way. Think OLAs, but a little bit better. The overarching specification and the agile awareness of ISO 20000 allows for consistency across the whole value chain. So all good so far. Well, easy to do for new contracts and reprocurement. I say easy, relative term, of course. But we're not always in a place where we have clean, neat, easy reprocurements. The internal dimension does always require work on culture change and business architecture to reach a full understanding of what those contributing teams are all about. Taking the time to do even a cursory capability mapping makes a big difference to the outcomes, especially in the government procurement arena. Standardized offerings and commercial and financial approaches really don't readily support an agile delivery, and they can distract the contracting manager from the needs of the service. Using a formulaic specification and that recognized standard makes it hard for commercial colleagues to resist and provide greater clarity of the obligations and the KPIs that we want to use. So let's shift the graphics onto my new world now. So apart from the experiences of last week, when it was 30 degrees plus, I love a good tube map. Not this time, of course. It's just a little bit confused. We seldom start with a greenfield site. That's true of everywhere I've been, apart from startups. It's never more than in a large organization, like a government body, where there's been, over many years, amalgamation of bodies that have grown through many iterations, many redefinitions. Those things add the complexity of sort of multiple businesses being layered one atop the other. We need to have some form of detailed analysis. And if you start with the tyranny of a blank page, we often miss things. This is particularly true in some of the older heritage environments. And it's true of most government legacy for that reason. We have technologies and services which are often end of life, go back many, many years, and they require bespoke and specific support. Sometimes those support mechanisms, those tools, those languages, those technologies don't exist anymore, and people are not able to actually support those sorts of services anymore. So understanding how to layer those and bring those together is always a challenge. But beginning with the specification and applying business architecture principles, it gives a useful starting point in new generation service contracts, and it did in the MOJ. Not without its challenges. We found that some suppliers were very ready to demonstrate that they were ISO 20000 compliant, or that they had certification, but some were simply not in that space at all. And as Mark mentioned, many businesses don't see the benefit of that, despite it being an international standard. And surprisingly, that was true of a number of the larger monolithic providers as well. Discovering other departments who had already started the journey, excuse me, on ISO 20000 was a very happy coincidence. And in fact, it was through ITSMF that I met one or two of those colleagues. It helped reduce some of the newbie mistakes we were going to make. It meant that we got to leverage some of the knowledge that had already been developed. So it's about maturing the core. It's about distilling the service management processes somewhat. And by no means is this diagram exhaustive, but we needed to mature those core activities. Alongside the ISO 20000 approach, we implemented a Lean Six Sigma approach to reduce waste and focus on the efficiencies and the efficacy required for good customer experience. Now, ITSM doesn't operate in a vacuum. It certainly doesn't operate in isolation in any shape or form. And so we needed to be working in concert with tools, processes, and capabilities across the entire organization for it to be successful. And if my screen will move on, here we go. So using a strategic technology direction as the frame, so that the black axis gives us some framework for collecting our operational delivery into buckets, increases the opportunity for what's sometimes referred to as systems thinking, but on a different palette. This included the embedded versus the interfaced ITSM elements, which Jeff referred to earlier, in terms of problem management and, you know, do we embed those in the squads? Do we interface those elsewhere? The complementary loops of ITSM and DevOps became easier and easier to interface, both through internal supply and external partner provision. With reference to the Lean Six Sigma approach, an almost immediate improvement was seen in one particular area that we used as a proof of concept, and that was in supporting the continuous integration and continuous delivery by improving the change management approach. So the traditional cab that everybody knows and hates, that lasts sort of, you know, ad infinitum when we're trying to get some change through, we were looking at around a 14-day to live process in MOJ. That was brought down to 2 days within the first month of applying our Lean Six Sigma approach. It was further brought down to 1 day for manual deliveries, and automation, of course, was instantaneous. Continuous iteration of the 20K assurance gave consistency, and it was independent of the assurer. So that means the team themselves didn't impact the footprint because we had that overarching control mechanism that was an easy set of tools and rules to apply, but they were agile aware. So the benefits of the blended approach. ITIL 4 is a great source of training. It really is the way to encourage ITSM professionals to understand the landscape, but it's not enough to meet the needs of modern ITSM. ISO 20000 is an auditable norm. It's got 256 hard requirements, which must be met. ITIL 4 is mostly descriptive. Implementing ISO 20000 facilitates an integrated service management system supporting vital functions and the management of those functions. Ideally, ITIL 4 should be maintained as an individual source of training, but it needs to be adapted to the needs of modern ITSM, incorporating agile methodologies, integrating with DevOps, or more specifically, DevSecOps. ISO 20000 is designed to be flexible and adaptable, makes it easier for organizations to customize to fit their specific needs. And finally, the last point I wanted to make was that ISO 20000 emphasizes the importance of a continuous improvement. It helps the organization stay ahead of the curve. It helps with collaboration. It helps with effectively managing suppliers and effectively managing internal suppliers. I'm going to stop there.